For years, gospel fans believed they had a couple they could look up to. Tamela and David Mann were the very definition of love, faith, and unity, or so it seemed. Together, they built a kingdom made of soulful worship, family values, and the kind of joy that only seemed possible in movies. But behind the lights, behind the smiles, behind every harmonized hallelujah, there was something much darker lurking in the shadows. Now, that truth has come to light, and it has rocked the gospel world to its core. Tamela Mann's explosive truth breaks the gospel illusion wide open. The very man she once called her king, her partner, her protector, David Mann, has now been arrested. This isn't a rumor whispered in quiet church pews. It's not gossip tossed around in comment sections. It's a truth spoken by Tamela herself, backed by documents, footage, and years of suppressed pain. At the center of this emotional eruption is not just a broken marriage. It is a fallen empire. One built on a foundation that the public never saw. Secrecy, control, and emotional chains that held Tamela down while the world celebrated her strength. It all began unraveling when Tamela's son, known publicly as Jerb, went live on Instagram. In a single video, he didn't just reveal family drama. He poured out years of buried reality, igniting a firestorm. He claimed Tamela wasn't just overworked, she was pushed to perform while in declining health. According to him, she was given pills without clear explanation. She performed in front of crowds with an oxygen tank hidden behind the curtains. Her body was failing while her fans were cheering. The video sent shockwaves through the gospel community. At first, many couldn't believe it. The David Mann they knew prayed before every meal, cracked jokes, and praised his wife endlessly in public. How could he be accused of such cruelty? But Jerb didn't stop there. He described his father as a man who had taken the family and turned it into a brand. No longer a home, no longer a sanctuary, just a business. And Tamela? She was the face of it all. The name, the product, the star everyone expected to shine, no matter how dim her world had become. Then, the moment that no one saw coming arrived. Tamela herself called the police, not a manager, not a church elder, not even a friend. She called 911. Sources say her voice during the call was barely steady. Years of silence, of holding it all together, cracked in a single moment. That phone call wasn't just about getting help. It was about finally breaking free. But what pushed her to make that call? According to insider reports, Tamela had recently discovered legal documents she didn't recall ever signing. Among them were power of attorney papers that gave David full control over her finances, medical decisions, and legal rights. She was stunned. Her signature was there, but she had no memory of agreeing to such terms. Even more chilling, Tamela allegedly found out that David had taken out multiple life insurance policies in her name. These were signed just weeks before she had a major health scare that left her bedridden and vulnerable. The timing? Too suspicious. The amounts? Enormous. And all of them listed David as the sole beneficiary. These discoveries left Tamela devastated. Not only was her body failing, but now she realized her autonomy had been stripped away without her knowledge. And she wasn't the only one horrified. Her daughter, Portia, stood by her mother's side as the layers of deception were peeled back. In one moment of vulnerability, Tamela reportedly looked at Portia and whispered, "He's taken everything from me." Portia didn't hesitate. She became her mother's rock, a quiet supporter who had watched her mother suffer for too long. She told Tamela it was time to stop holding everyone else up. "Now it's time someone holds you," she said. That was the final push Tamela needed. She picked up the phone and called for help. When the police arrived at the Mann home, David didn't resist. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. According to witnesses, he was eerily calm, whispering scripture under his breath as officers placed handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply walked out of the home he once controlled. While David was taken away in silence, Tamela was surrounded by family and medical professionals. Many had been waiting for this moment, not because they wanted David to fall, but because they needed Tamela to rise. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. As the news spread, fans were in disbelief. Could this really be happening? The couple that inspired thousands with their songs and TV shows was now at the center of one of the most disturbing scandals gospel music had ever seen. But for Tamela, this was not the beginning of the end. It was the start of her freedom. Old interviews began resurfacing. Fans started rewatching clips and noticing what they had once overlooked. Tamela's long pauses before answering questions. Her eyes drifted off camera. Her voice softened when David interrupted her. These once subtle moments now screamed louder than ever. What once looked like shyness now appeared to be fear. And the evidence kept coming. Tamela's legal team dug deeper. They found email exchanges between David and their business manager. In those emails, they discussed what would happen if Tamela became too sick to work. One line stood out more than any other. "She doesn't need to be on stage to keep the brand alive. We just need the image." Let that sink in. It wasn't about her health. It wasn't about her healing. It was about the image, the brand, the money. Even if she couldn't sing another note, they planned to keep her presence alive using technology, recordings, and licensing. Tamela's body may have been failing, but her name was still profitable. And David, according to these emails, intended to capitalize on that. What made this betrayal even worse was the footage. Real footage. Not rumors, not speculation. Actual video from inside Tamela and David's home. According to sources close to the investigation, Tamela was shown clips from their home security system that captured moments no one was ever supposed to see. These weren't staged, scripted scenes for a show. This was real life, raw and unraveling. One clip reportedly showed David pacing back and forth, raising his voice, accusing Tamela of being selfish and weak while she struggled to breathe. At that moment, she wasn't Tamela, the gospel star. She was just a woman gasping for air, clutching her chest, terrified. Instead of helping her, David stormed out of the room. His words still echo. "You're not going to ruin everything we built just because you want to be dramatic." Dramatic. That was how he described a medical emergency. Tamela broke down after watching the footage. It wasn't just the shouting or the lack of concern. It was seeing her suffering dismissed as inconvenience. And for the first time, she couldn't pretend anymore. The emotional weight of those videos pushed her deeper into a place she thought she'd never recover from. But that's when her daughter Portia stepped up in full force. Portia wasn't just a bystander. She became the protector her mother never had. She coordinated with Tamela's lawyers, doctors, and security. She removed every person connected to David from Tamela's care. No more handlers, no more promoters, just family. And Tamela? She was moved to a private, secure location, away from the cameras, away from the tour buses, away from the man who had controlled every part of her life. For the first time in years, she could rest without being handed a microphone. But the fallout was just beginning. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the story became. Former employees began speaking out quietly at first, then louder. One said David intercepted Tamela's personal mail. Another claimed he screened all of her calls. One even said that he decided who could and couldn't visit her during her recovery periods. Every move she made, every decision about her body and her life, had allegedly passed through David. Her legal team also uncovered contracts with Tamela's signature contracts she swore she never signed. One allowed a company to use her voice in AI-generated gospel tracks. Tamela was supposedly licensing her vocals for future albums, even if she never returned to the studio. But she had no memory of agreeing to that deal. No copy of the contract. Just a signature that looked like hers. That wasn't just manipulation. That was a forgery. And then came the insurance documents. 3 separate life insurance policies, all taken out within a 2-month window, all naming David as the sole beneficiary. The timing was deeply suspicious. Tamela's health crisis had happened shortly after. The amounts were in the high 6-figure range. One policy even included a clause for tour disruption compensation in the event of her illness or death. Translation: if Tamela couldn't perform, the payout would cover losses for canceled shows. That wasn't about faith. That was planning for profit. As this information came to light, the gospel community erupted. Fans were horrified. Some stood by David, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. But many began to see the truth. Social media filled with hashtags like #JusticeForTamela and #GospelGate. Facebook groups held prayer vigils. Twitter turned into an online investigation board. Old clips of David preaching were now being picked apart, word by word. Even artists who once toured with the couple began to speak out. One gospel singer tweeted, "You never know what's happening behind gospel curtains. Praying for Tamela." Another commented anonymously saying, "There were nights we had to carry her off stage. Now I see it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something darker." And the spotlight began turning toward the industry itself. According to leaked information, this wasn't just about David. It went deeper. Some gospel executives and tour managers were allegedly aware of Tamela's condition, but they kept pushing her to perform. One promoter is even accused of offering bonuses to David to keep her on stage, no matter how sick she was. Medical staff would be on standby backstage, ready to help if she collapsed. This wasn't just a family crisis. This was exploitation on an institutional level. And while all this happened, many church leaders who had once praised the Manns went silent. Pastors who had featured them in sermons were now deleting old posts. Some issued vague statements about praying for healing, but refused to answer direct questions. Others erased sermons from YouTube. When pressed, one church's media manager simply said, "We are not taking questions at this time." But the fans weren't staying quiet. Not this time. They remembered the songs Tamela sang, the same songs they played during funerals, hospital stays, and moments of personal pain. Her voice had brought healing to so many, and now they knew. While she helped others heal, she was breaking inside. It felt like betrayal. Even TikTok users joined in. One video showed an interview from 2019, where David interrupted Tamela 5 times in less than 60 seconds while she tried to talk about her health. The TikTok caption read, "Now it makes sense. He never let her speak." Every clip, every interview, every sermon was being rewatched with new eyes. What once seemed like a sweet couple dynamic now looked like control. Behind the gospel's golden image was a woman silenced, a voice controlled, a life restricted. Tamela wasn't just a singer. She was a survivor of something much bigger than anyone had imagined. And now, for the first time, she was reclaiming her story. As Tamela began stepping away from the life that had nearly broken her, the ripple effect reached far beyond her home. This wasn't just a private crisis anymore. It had turned into a public reckoning. And with every new revelation, it became clear this was a gospel empire built on pain. David Mann's arrest marked the beginning of a full-scale investigation. And what began as a family matter soon drew attention from both state and federal authorities. Financial documents, medical records, and legal contracts were under review. Investigators discovered a spreadsheet showing over $650,000 in unexplained withdrawals from Tamela's business accounts in just 14 months. The descriptions were vague. Travel expenses, production fees, pastoral outreach. But they didn't match Tamela's actual movements or condition during that time. Where was the money going? That question became central to the investigation. More damning still was a leaked email from a tech company. They had offered David a $300,000 advance to create 3 albums using Tamela's old vocals combined with artificial enhancements. The twist? Tamela never saw the contract. She never agreed to the deal. Her legal team believes her signature was forged. Someone tried to build an AI-powered gospel career using her voice while she lay in bed, too sick to sing. Church leaders who once paraded the Manns as role models were now retreating into silence. Sermons featuring the couple vanished from YouTube. Facebook posts were deleted. When questioned, their staff refused to respond. A few posted cryptic Bible verses. One pastor tweeted, "God reveals truth in His time." But the fans weren't accepting vague prayers. They wanted answers. And now, federal investigators stepped in. According to sources close to the case, the FBI had begun reviewing Tamela's situation. The reason? Some of the funds in question were tied to church-sponsored events and donation-based performances. That made it more than just personal fraud. It raised the possibility of a faith-based financial crime. A senior investigator said anonymously, "When we see forged signatures, manipulation of medical decisions, and unexplained finances involving someone in a vulnerable state, we're no longer just in civil territory. We're dealing with possible federal charges." That meant the case was growing much bigger than anyone imagined. And while the law was building its case, the public was unraveling years of illusions. Fans who had followed the Manns for over a decade felt stunned and betrayed. The woman who had led them in worship, who had been the voice of their healing, had been suffering behind closed doors, and no one had seen it. Or maybe some had seen it and said nothing. Social media became a digital courtroom. Fan accounts once dedicated to celebrating the Manns became platforms for truth-telling. Old interviews were clipped, analyzed, and reinterpreted. One clip from a stage tour showed Tamela wincing and grabbing her chest before continuing to sing. The crowd cheered, unaware. But now, in light of the revelations, that moment looked like someone forced to push through physical agony while her health collapsed. Even those who had worked closely with the family were starting to speak up. One gospel artist who toured with the couple anonymously shared, "There were times Tamela was so weak, we had to carry her off stage. It wasn't about faith. It was about fear. We didn't want to lose our jobs. But looking back now, we should have spoken up." And then came Portia. Tamela's daughter, once quiet and behind the scenes, had now stepped forward as her mother's fiercest defender. Portia reportedly took full control of Tamela's medical care, legal affairs, and financial access. Every password, every document, every account that David once had access to is now blocked. In a private message leaked to close family, Portia allegedly wrote, "We're not covering anything anymore. Mama gave her life to everyone. Now, she's taking it back." That sentence would come to define the next chapter of Tamela's story. Tamela was no longer in the family home. She had moved to a secure, undisclosed location where she was under 24-hour medical and emotional care. Her caregivers were licensed professionals. Her support system was no longer staff, promoters, or industry agents. It was family. People who truly loved her, not what she represented. For the first time in years, she was sleeping peacefully. In a private voice memo shared with a small support group, Tamela's voice was heard quietly saying, "I forgot what peace felt like." That line, soft and simple, became the most heartbreaking part of the entire tragedy. Peace. The very thing her music had brought others. She had lived without it. And while she recovered in private, the public world around her continued to collapse. Major networks began canceling reruns of the Mann family's sitcoms. Licensing agreements were suspended. Tour dates vanished from websites. Sponsorship deals disappeared overnight. No statement was released from David. His team remained completely silent. There were no interviews, no damage control. He had vanished from the spotlight entirely. But Tamela's truth didn't need to be shouted. It was being felt, understood, believed. This wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the exposure of an entire system that had allowed exploitation in the name of faith. And gospel fans, churchgoers, and women across the country were finally saying enough. As Tamela continued her healing journey in private, a wave of accountability began rising in the very gospel circles that once celebrated the Mann family as royalty. But it wasn't just a shift in public opinion. It was a long overdue awakening. For years, people had seen signs but looked away. Now, they were watching closely. And what they saw was a woman who had been used, manipulated, and silenced, finally reclaiming her voice. Churches that had once competed to host the Manns now found themselves under scrutiny. Some leaders issued quick statements, not of support, but self-protection. Others quietly deleted years' worth of posts, sermons, and photos featuring David and Tamela. But for the gospel community, that wasn't enough. Fans weren't just grieving the fall of a beloved public figure. They were re-examining their own relationship with a culture that praised endurance over wellness, loyalty over truth, and image over integrity. More survivors began to speak up. Women in other faith-based marriages, singers in gospel groups, even assistants who had worked under tight, controlling contracts. They saw themselves in Tamela's story. One former backup singer said in an anonymous statement, "When I toured with them, Tamela was always in pain, always tired, but she never said no. We thought it was strength. Now we know it was survival." And that word survival became central to Tamela's truth. This wasn't a scandal born out of rage or revenge. It was the outcome of someone who had been slowly stripped of control, now trying to get it back. The legal case her team was building reflected that. Multiple law firms and a forensic accounting team were reviewing every financial decision made in her name for the past 5 years. Court filings, still sealed, reportedly included bank records, signed contracts, insurance policies, forged documents, and medical history pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, painted a devastating picture. Among the most alarming discoveries was how isolated Tamela had become in recent years. Friends had stopped hearing from her directly. Staff would speak on her behalf. Emails were sent from accounts she no longer controlled. Even her own calendar was being managed by David and his team. It wasn't just about keeping her on stage. It was about keeping her out of the loop. And in many ways, that's exactly how the illusion lasted so long. Tamela's public appearances gave no hint of the storm behind closed doors. Her voice remained powerful, her smile ever present. Even in interviews, when David interrupted or redirected the conversation, fans assumed it was just their dynamic. Looking back, it now felt like she had been rehearsing a role, one she never agreed to play. Then came the turning point when federal authorities officially launched a financial exploitation case. The leaked report confirmed that investigators were particularly focused on how faith-based donations were used. If Tamela's performances at churches and religious conferences were funded by congregational giving, and if the money was misused without her consent, it could lead to charges of religious fraud. And if David's control over her health and schedule contributed to her decline, there could be additional claims of medical negligence and elder abuse. One investigator reportedly told a journalist off record, "What we're looking at may not just be a crime of opportunity. It could be premeditated, carefully executed over time, and it's not just limited to one person." Those words sent shockwaves through the gospel industry. Because if others knew if they helped hide the truth or ignored red flags, they too could be held accountable. Producers, promoters, label executives, even church administrators could be implicated. And yet, through all of this, Tamela chose silence. Not out of fear this time, but peace. She didn't go live to vent. She didn't post emotional rants. She let her actions speak. Her legal filings, her medical recovery, her daughter's quiet strength, and most of all, her absence from the spotlight. That silence spoke volumes. But it was her daughter Portia who carried the torch forward in public. She answered emails. She coordinated with attorneys. She scheduled medical care. She even blocked multiple media outlets from reaching Tamela directly. Her message was simple: "My mother is not for sale." Tamela was now resting in safety, surrounded by people who loved her, not her fame. Not her voice, not her brand, just her. In one moment, caught on audio by a family friend, Tamela was heard saying, "I didn't think I'd make it out, but I did, and I'm not going back." That short sentence became a kind of anthem for others. Fans began posting it under her old videos as a show of support and solidarity, a declaration of survival. And it was clear now, this wasn't just a celebrity story. It was a movement. A woman who once sang to uplift others was now being lifted herself. By people who believed her. By people who saw through the glitter of gospel entertainment and into the heart of the pain she carried. The Mann family brand, once seen as unshakable, was collapsing. David had vanished from public view. His representatives refused to comment. Business partnerships dissolved quietly. Touring contracts were dropped. Gospel networks stopped airing replays. Award show organizers made internal decisions to distance themselves from the controversy. But Tamela wasn't asking for anyone to choose sides. She was simply asking to be seen, heard, believed, and now she finally was. With each new revelation, the silence surrounding Tamela's pain was replaced by a growing chorus of support. The more the public learned, the more people realized how deep the betrayal ran. This wasn't just about one man's misconduct. It was about how a system had protected him, ignored warning signs, and profited from Tamela's suffering. The documents now in the hands of Tamela's lawyers were unlike anything fans had imagined. They included emails between David and multiple gospel tour promoters. In these conversations, there were references to Tamela's declining health. One promoter reportedly offered David additional incentives if Tamela could push through just 3 more shows. Another email referenced backstage oxygen access as part of her rider. These weren't signs of compassion. They were clear examples of how her health had become a business calculation. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation of insurance planning. 3 large life insurance policies had been activated in the weeks leading up to Tamela's health collapse. Each one listed David as the only beneficiary. Each one included clauses related to canceled performances. And Tamela, still under medical supervision, reportedly had no idea these documents existed. The paperwork was there, the signatures were there, but consent? Missing. These weren't coincidences, they were strategies. And when investigators began connecting the dots between financial activity, forged documents, and health-related decisions, the case shifted into a different category: potential criminal conspiracy. Meanwhile, fans continued to comb through Tamela's public appearances. The more they watched, the more they noticed the subtle signs. Tamela often let David do most of the talking during interviews. When she did speak, she was cautious, always checking his expression before answering. Fans found clips where she flinched slightly when he raised his voice. Moments that once seemed like nerves now appeared as signs of control. TikTok became a hub of truth-telling. Creators posted side-by-side videos showing how Tamela changed over time. Her posture, her eye contact, her tone. One viral clip highlighted a gospel awards ceremony where Tamela accepted an honor but barely smiled. David stood beside her, gripping the microphone. The caption read, "Her voice gave us chills." But did anyone ever ask if she was okay? The gospel community was no longer watching in silence. One well-known gospel singer wrote on Instagram, "You can love God and still walk away from what's hurting you." Another commented, "We need to stop protecting titles more than people." These weren't vague sentiments. They were direct messages of support for Tamela and rebukes to those who stayed silent. And still, David said nothing. No statements, no interviews, no videos, not even a denial. His legal team remained unreachable. His former staff refused to comment. It was as if the man who once appeared on stage every week had disappeared into thin air. But the damage was already done. Major entertainment networks began cutting ties with the Mann brand. Streaming platforms quietly removed shows from their rotation. Gospel award committees launched internal reviews. Churches that once proudly featured the couple began issuing new policies for artist partnerships, focusing on consent, medical safety, and ethical oversight. And then came the federal subpoenas. According to inside sources, financial documents involving David, Tamela's management team, and several gospel event organizers were requested by investigators. The primary concern were donations from churches and fan-based giving being misused under Tamela's name? If so, it would no longer be a domestic dispute. It would become a federal fraud case. One investigator put it simply, if you're making medical decisions for someone without their full awareness and using that person's image to generate revenue, you're not just abusing trust. You're committing a crime. Meanwhile, Tamela's physical health was beginning to improve, but emotionally, she was still in recovery. Her medical team reported steady progress. Her family remained protective. No interviews, no photos, no public events, just peace. And for Tamela, peace wasn't just about silence. It was about control. For the first time in years, she decided who could visit, who could speak on her behalf, what she would say, what she would sign. Everything that had been taken from her, her voice, her rights, her dignity, was now being reclaimed. Her daughter, Portia, remained the force behind her recovery. Portia was fierce, focused, and unwavering. She coordinated every step, from medical appointments to legal paperwork to blocking access from David's associates. In a leaked voice memo to a family friend, Portia reportedly said, "My mother isn't going back. Not physically, not emotionally, not legally." And that's when the civil suit was announced. Tamela's legal team officially filed claims of elder exploitation, fraudulent financial activity, coercive control, and medical negligence. Though the documents remained sealed, sources familiar with the case described them as devastating. One insider said, "There are things in there that, once made public, could destroy careers. Not just David's, but several people behind the scenes." But this wasn't about destruction. It was about truth. Tamela had spent her life lifting others through music, through ministry, through every note she sang. Now, the world was lifting her, not as a celebrity, not as a singer, but as a woman who had survived what others didn't even realize was happening. And though she hadn't spoken publicly, her message was clear. In a private message shared among close supporters, Tamela reportedly said, "I didn't walk away to ruin anyone. I walked away because I needed to live, not survive, live." And in that moment, everything changed. Tamela wasn't just a gospel artist anymore. She had become a symbol for truth, for freedom, for every woman who had smiled through pain and been told to pray instead of speak. Her music may have stopped for now, but her testimony had just begun. By the time Tamela's story had reached every corner of gospel media, the illusion that had protected David Mann and the empire built around him was gone. The perfect image had shattered, and in its place stood something more powerful truth. Raw, painful, undeniable truth. As the legal case built momentum, insiders began warning that the real fallout hadn't even started. One source close to the investigation said, "If the full list of names involved gets released, the gospel world will never be the same." Contracts, emails, audio recordings, voice memos, footage from inside the Mann residence. All of it had been collected and sealed, waiting for the right moment to be brought to court. Fans who had once idolized David now saw a different man, the leader who prayed on stage, the husband who always held his wife's hand in public. The father figure was praised in Christian circles. That version had faded. In its place stood allegations of control, coercion, and calculated betrayal. And as the trial date loomed closer, something unexpected happened. Other gospel figures began quietly distancing themselves. Artists who had collaborated with the Manns stopped reposting old tour photos. Pastors who once invited the couple into their churches removed sermons from their websites. PR teams scrubbed YouTube pages and redirected comment sections. Some even issued vague statements about protecting the flock. But not everyone stayed quiet. A few brave voices from the gospel industry spoke out. One singer, who had once toured with Tamela, said in a live stream, "We all saw the signs. We just didn't want to believe them. We thought it was a ministry. It was manipulation." Another gospel musician added, "You don't need to be on stage to serve God. Sometimes stepping off it is the holiest thing you can do." And Tamela? She still hadn't spoken publicly, but her silence had transformed. It was no longer forced. It was chosen. Her peace, her privacy, her stillness became her protest. Behind the scenes, her world was slowly being rebuilt. Portia continued managing every aspect of her care. Security was tightened. Only a handful of family members and trusted friends knew Tamela's location. Her doctors reported steady recovery, both physically and mentally. And most importantly, she was free from the people, the contracts, the performances, and the expectations that had once consumed her life. Her legal team worked quietly, but with precision. Every signature on every questionable document was being verified. Every payment is traced. Every performance reviewed. Tamela was no longer the brand. She was the client, the decision-maker, the one in control. And then came the mugshot. Though quietly released, It spread across social media like wildfire. David Mann, no smile, no charisma, just a man standing before the law. The image hit hard, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. The fall was no longer hypothetical. It had happened, and it couldn't be ignored. Tamela's supporters didn't gloat. They grieved, not just for her, but for the years they'd unknowingly cheered while she suffered. The Sunday morning songs, the family-friendly shows, the sermons and skits. It all felt different now. One fan commented online, "She healed us while she was breaking." And we never knew. In private support groups, women shared their own stories of being silenced, of being manipulated by people hiding behind faith, of being told to submit while they suffered in silence. Tamela's story gave them courage. It gave them words. And while the legal battle prepared to move forward, the industry held its breath. Networks began canceling upcoming gospel specials. Sponsors quietly backed out of long-standing partnerships. Tour managers re-evaluated artist safety protocols. And award shows, once proud to honor the Manns, now scrambled to separate themselves from the scandal. But Tamela wasn't watching the headlines. She was resting, surrounded by family, restoring her voice not for performance, but for purpose. In one final private voice message shared by a trusted supporter, Tamela said, "I thought my story was over, but maybe this is the beginning. Not of fame, not of applause, of life, real life." And those words echoed across an industry that had once silenced her. No more rehearsed statements, no more red carpets, no more staged worship, just the truth. And it was louder than any gospel song. The gospel world had been shaken. And maybe it needed to be, because behind the glitter, the choirs, and the perfect harmonies, there were people, real people, some in pain, some are trapped in silence. And Tamela's truth had opened the door for all of them. This was no longer about David. It wasn't about image or business. It was about survival, freedom, and finally, justice. And Tamela Mann, the woman who once asked the world to take me to the king, had found her way back to herself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's product, not as someone's paycheck, but as a woman, a survivor, a mother, a truth teller. Her music may have paused, but her story had just begun.